Hello and welcome everyone to SciArt Santa Fe's laser series, InPlace, Recentering Ecocritical Knowledge of the Natural World. Spanish interpretation is available by clicking the globe at the bottom of your Zoom window, selecting Spanish, and if you wish, muting original audio. If you're joining us by phone, you'll find language interpretation by clicking the more or ellipses, the three-dot icon, and choosing language interpretation. And we will add instructions in Spanish and English in chat periodically throughout the webinar. SciArt Santa Fe offers programs that integrate art and science. And thanks to Dr. Andrea Poli and Susan Latham, our laser co-chairs, we are part of an international group of organizations coordinating with Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Sciences, and Technology, to host Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous, and we call them lasers for short. And lasers are informal gatherings to discuss art and science and their integration and other topics. And for more information, please visit sciartsantafe.org. This laser series is made possible with the generous support of the New Mexico Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we thank them very much for supporting this series. And any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the New Mexico Humanities Council. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for today's laser. A Chicana writer from the northern New Mexican village of Chutas, Alicia Inez Guzmán explores histories of land use in New Mexico and the Southwest. She holds a PhD in visual and cultural studies from the University of Rochester in New York. And I would like to thank Alicia, not only for her services in AmeriCorps Vista, but because she's really largely responsible for bringing this laser series to all of us. So Alicia, if we could give you a round of applause in person, we would, but right now I think we'll just say thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, so I'm so happy to be here with everybody. I'm Alicia Inez Guzmán, and I'm coming to you from Santa Fe, the traditional ancestral lands of the Tewa relatives, also known as Ogapoge. So I would like to honor our indigenous relatives here. I'm so happy to be joined with by Valerie Rangel and Will Wilson. Valerie is an alumna of the University of New Mexico, where she earned a Bachelor of University Studies that carried a concentration in freshwater studies and cultural anthropology. She also holds a graduate degree from the Master of Community Regional Planning, where she majored in natural resources and environmental planning, with coursework in Indigenous planning and a minor in public health. Her book, Environmental Justice in New Mexico, Counting Coup, presents stories of strife and struggle in the war to protect the integrity of natural systems, rights to religious freedom, and the continuation of traditional customs. She is currently the Community Outreach Manager for the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. Will Wilson's art projects center around the continuation and transformation of customary Indigenous cultural practice. He is a Diné photographer and trans-customary artist who spent his formative years living on the Navajo Nation. Wilson studied photography, sculpture, and art history at the University of New Mexico and Oberlin College. In 2007, Wilson won the Native American Fine Art Fellowship from the Idle-Jorg Museum. In 2010, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award for Sculpture, and in 2016, the Pollock Krasner Foundation Grant for Photography. Wilson has held visiting professorships at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Oberlin College, and the University of Arizona. In 2017, Wilson received the New Mexico Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts. His work is exhibited and collected nationally and internationally. Will is currently the program head of the photography program at Santa Fe Community College. So I'm so happy to be here with Will and with Valerie, talking about something that I think is very timely and yet in some ways has been plaguing our communities for quite some time. Environmental racism is nothing new here in New Mexico and in the Southwest. And so I think it's a really poignant time to have conversations about how environmental racism continues to affect our communities of color and our Indigenous communities, especially because we're in a pandemic. So, you know, to really kick off the conversation, because this is a conversation, I want to, before we get into this question of what is environmental racism, I want to talk about place-based forms of knowledge, non-Western forms of knowledge, Indigenous forms of knowledge that aren't necessarily acknowledged or considered through a traditional science-based, Western-based kind of lens, and how when we look at these other kinds of knowledge systems that have persisted and that have defined cosmologies and how we know the world for so long, how those actually can lead us forward. So let's start that with that question about, you know, what place-based knowledge and this non-Western knowledge means to both of you in your practices.
I can jump in. I just have to acknowledge that Native people have been scientists for a long, long time. We've been keen observers of the world, ethnobotanists, cartographers. We have had this evidence of high skills mathematics in the Mayan pyramids, in Chaco Canyon, and the building of roadways, in the petroglyphs and pictographs that are painted on walls are actually something that we haven't even completely figured out what the messaging is, but we definitely know it's certainly a relationship between observation and just the wisdom of thousands of years of knowledge and understanding how we do farming, how we practice curanderismo. This is our relationship with the stars is inherent. And I think as we move forward, we have to remind our youth that these are components which are not always taught in Western science, and that our migration, our oral histories, our creation stories are all part of our worldview, but they also inform us of what's happened within the natural world. I think that more and more we're starting to see it's important to know what's in your backyard, what plants, how animals are changing, how to create a shelter, where sources of water are. All those things are very important as we continue forward, as we know there's going to be climate change. I hope that we prepare our youth in these meaningful ways.
Boy, that's profound, Valerie. Yeah, I mean, I think that your point about being scientists or, you know, keen observers, ethnobotanists, people who've kind of worked in conjunction with natural resources to develop, you know, seed that functions as this incredible technology, like in different kind of environs in the Southwest, is something that I've thought a fair amount about. I've also thought about how far away, like, I feel from that, even though I'm only like 1 or 2 generations, like from that knowledge, and how quick that has transformed. And I think, I don't know, a lot of my work is kind of responding to like the traumatic realization of that, like, distance and shift, but then also thinking about ways to respond and to get back to that knowledge, because the people who hold that, those culture bearers and those knowledge bearers, those Indigenous scientists, are still with us, and they still hold that knowledge, and it's there to be kind of accessed and learned. And you know, I think it's actively going on. It's just not happening at the same kind of level that it had historically. but yeah, I mean, when you were talking about knowing our environment, like I've often thought about, like, I know more about the layout of like Target or like Walmart than I do about like the living creatures in, like, you know, the immediate radius of where I live. And that's a kind of shocking thing.
Yeah, no kidding. When you kind of come to realization with that, I think I can relate because I'm one or two generations away from, a very place-based kind of knowledge, and like it's almost like the return back. It takes a while, right? You have to like learn knowledge and then unlearn other knowledge, which I think is, the other half of it. And um, you know, I think one of the kind of issues that we see is that climate change isn't actually really that new. It's been happening in New Mexico for quite some time just because of the fact that we've been extracted from for so long. And so, like, even though it's a trending kind of thing to talk about and to create policy around, that's also something that's persisted in our communities as well. Like, we have this knowledge and this resilience, and then we also have extractive industries that have um, really targeted our communities here. And so I'm wondering, now that we have this kind of foundation in terms of what knowledge looks like or can look like, we can tackle this question, which, is it's deceptively simple and yet so complex. What is environmental racism? And specifically, what is it here?
I think that climate change has started, and it really just dates back to the earth is dynamic. I think Native people have always known this. And I was thinking back about your introduction and how we are now acknowledging everywhere we go what Indigenous folks' land that we're on, but we forget that there are stories that date back and we don't include everyone. My Apache ancestors have told me that Santa Fe, where I'm residing now, has been their home for a long time. And even though they're down in Mescalero on the reservation that they were forced to be put on, that there are stories of watching the volcanoes erupt here from the plateau of Santa Fe. So I feel like we've always been in a nice dynamic environment. And if you think about geologically speaking, when those volcanoes erupted, those were thousands of years ago. And we are told by anthropologists that Navajo and Apache entered 500 years ago, right? Into the Four Corners region. We migrated from somewhere over Athabascan, all these other things. So we have to constantly challenge ourselves in what we think. But environmental racism, I see it as two different things. I see it towards a deliberate placement of the extraction industry, of dumping chemicals and toxic waste into certain people's backyards. I see it as energy production and polluting industry being deliberately placed in marginalized communities. Those happen to be low income, the majority of folks being color a lot of times, but not always, right? The Appalachians are a good example. There are, I think the biggest difference between the racism aspect and just what people think of as environmental justice issues is that if it's deliberate, that means that the folks who are being borne the brunt of environmental toxins, they don't have the privilege of other folks. They don't have resources, money to hire lawyers for their defense. They're working several jobs sometimes as essential workers. And that means that they can't afford to take time off so that they can voice their comments and their concerns at hearings. Maybe they've been shut out of the legislative process because they just don't have the broadband or the internet access. And so a lot of times folks are just discouraged from even coming forth about racism, and don't even realize that it's happening because they're just trying to survive the daily life. But there's also the cumulative impacts that we don't think about, the socioeconomic inequalities, and the fact that this is all combined with folks who are now dealing with COVID. And so they just don't have the bandwidth, the capacity themselves to engage in a system that right now is upholding white supremacy. So that's how I sort of see that from a human aspect. But then there's an environmental justice aspect of what's happening to our natural world. And from an indigenous lens, the river and all the creatures, the earth itself is a deity, it's an entity that has life and deserves respect and privileges just as we do. Those are my thoughts. Well,
again, very profound. I don't know, just maybe to pick up on what you were just saying about like granting rights of like agency and recognition to you know, rivers and, you know, areas of land, mountains, you know, kind of understanding that like, we're part of that, and that those spaces deeply affect the way that our lives kind of play out, and that those, you know, that power needs to be respected and granted rights. And, you know, I guess if we have this kind of structure that we've developed around how we allot that power, that has to be recognized. You know, like in New Zealand, you know, they'll give rights to rivers, like, you know, quote unquote human rights or natural rights, right, that are on the same kind of level as human rights. And, you know, in the United States, we give corporations rights. You know, I think that there's definitely something to be said about, you know, climate change and how, you know, kind of networks of power and legislation and being able to kind of voice your concern in relation to what's going on, to kind of make structural changes. Like there's a reason why it's not easy for people to go to like environmental kind of assessment meetings, you know. I don't think that you were talking about the deliberate nature of that and how that's tied to, you know, white supremacy and power. And I think that, you know, those are not by coincidence, you know, that they're intentional. It also makes me think maybe too, in terms of climate change, of, I don't know, people have talked about like this ancestral Puebloan like collapse that actually happened over the course of a few hundred years, you know. I mean, if we think about our own kind of existence in relation to a few hundred years, we're kind of approaching like world environmental collapse in a couple hundred years, you know. I mean, the people who were moving, they were responding to also climate change, but I think a much more kind of naturalistic version of that. So, you know, even the way that kind of that's been talked about and theorized, I think is kind of problematic, and it speaks back to this kind of structural issue in relation to, you know, kind of science and I guess whose science it is, or whose like environmental assessment it is, you know. So I guess that's, you know, some thoughts about that.
Like the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not to like make a climate change, a bad joke about climate change. I mean, I think this question of like deliberate actions is really important to think about, because environmental racism, like racism, is not passive, right? It's not just, it happened, right? Somebody enacts it, and there are policies that are enacted against communities of color. And there are, the really diffuse ways that that happens that maybe are less visible or even graspable. And then there are the obvious and blatant ways that environmental racism takes place. And, I wonder if we can talk about that, like the visibilizing of environmental racism, and how we can actually grasp onto this, what some people might consider to be very abstract, but what is actually very material and embodied and surrounding us, right? So maybe we can talk about that a little bit in terms of, whether it's aesthetic practice or, Valerie, some of the things that you've observed, Will, some of the things that you've observed, in the Navajo Nation, observed or not observed, right? But they're there.
Mm-hmm.
I have some slides, if you don't mind, I can share. Because I think it's important.
Yeah.
Seeing is believing, right?
Yeah, that's like such a kind of like Western thing,
Yeah. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right, this is a really great quote, and it's from a book, Ecocide of Native America. And I'll read it real quick. I quote it in my book about the Four Corners, the land sacrifice zone. It's no accident, therefore, that the remote, sparsely populated West has been targeted so often in recent years by Eastern policymakers as a receptacle of deadly technological experiments. It's not just that we get these experiments because there's more room out here. It's more deliberate than that. This is a consciously evolved policy, a dangerous trend in United States history, and it has resulted in a de facto national policy of trading ecosystems, national sacrifice areas for economic gain, scientific data, and national security. And I really think that quote speaks to the heart of what's going on in our back of the neck of the woods. And I just want to share a couple of slides just so you can see that up above is the Gila River with wagons crossing 1885, and down below is the San Carlos Apache who used to roam that area, but don't anymore, and have been displaced for reasons. But as you can see, life does not look the way it does today. And now we know that there's this huge biological diversity, and we're worried about saving the Gila for different reasons, not that it's associated with these cultural connections, but these endemic species that can't be found elsewhere. So this is a layer of our system that maybe is invisible to most folks. We don't think about. We don't have the ecological integrity of all the bugs and creepy crawlies making our world go round and decomposing waste and whatnot. We are missing out on what life is really about. And some of that environmental racism that we don't think about is something that we forget, which is our basic water rights. Just in the news last week, I saw the state of Virginia that created a bill that would give humans access, basically the right, all humans within their state, the right to water. And I thought, well, here we are fighting for Rio Grande water all the time. And Anthony is 30 minutes away from the border of Mexico. So and water rarely makes it down the Rio Grande because of this racism of placing water rights to northern users, to other rights holders that have been fighting over it for hundreds of years. And yet we forget about the system, right? And that the actual river itself deserves the water rights. We also forget about the militarization that has happened. And Fort Wingate is a great example of something that was enacted in our history, which We forget about this long walk period of time where people were rounded up, a scorched earth policy that removed folks from their homeland, purposely incarcerated them, and then made them come back to receive rations and to work and to go to BIA schools at Fort Wingate and other places. This is an example of ethnic cleansing. But here's what happened to the land afterward. That militarization then turned into national security. So the little concrete bunkers that you see are lined and they haven't gone anywhere. They're contaminated with World War II, Vietnam era ammunitions, and other chemicals, hantavirus from back in the day, and a lot of uranium cleanup, or a lot of uranium toxins that have not been cleaned up because we were using weapons and housing them there. We forget the biggest incident that has happened in New Mexico, and this isn't popularized because we were supposedly sparsely populated, but July 16, 1979 was the largest uranium waste tailing spill in all of the United States. No one talks about that. And the area still hasn't been cleaned up. That's an example. And the uranium that was produced by the mines really impacted the workers. It was something that plagued the actual miners and their families that made their homes out of the extracted rock. And we still have over 500 abandoned uranium mines from this era of nuclear war development. And as a result, what we're seeing today is that folks who lived in these areas and often worked, they relied on spring water. And now during COVID, they lack infrastructure, they lack electricity. And the home up at the top is an example of being in the Four Corners area where there's P&M lines going back and forth, but the homes still lack electricity. And the World Health Organization has recognized that water should be fundamental for not only economic development, but just the basics of human life. It should be a human right. And what Navajos are doing now is hauling water still, but from non-potable sources, from sources of, because they can't often find water in the grocery stores of Walmart and Gallup and Farmington during the COVID times. They can't get out that far, they've been on lockdown. And even if they go hours and hours away, they still can't find resources. You know how scarce it's been with toilet paper, right, during this pandemic. So these folks have been relying on wells that are contaminated with uranium. So this era of environmental justice continues to plague our region. This is Los Alamos. And the picture at the bottom is what they call Acid Canyon, where waste was literally just shot out of a pipe and let go into the drainage systems, which of course, you know, finds its way into our groundwater systems. And we wonder why Santa Fe and Albuquerque have uranium contamination in our drinking water. It's because of these hydrological connections. And Los Alamos has been given under the Trump administration $3 billion to continue the development of nuclear weapons. This is something that continues to plague us. And who knows what the Biden administration is doing now about it, but that's something that we can act on, that we can encourage the use of that water to maybe take that $3 billion and put it towards infrastructure so people will have running water and sanitation for their homes. That's an idea, right? Basic human right. And I just want to show you that the drainage systems from Los Alamos eventually dump into the Rio Grande. Where does the Rio Grande go? If there's water allowed, it's supposed to dump into the Gulf of Mexico, right? But before it gets there, it's supposed to also feed us. And it goes through Hatch. And it's used by acequias from north to south. And so it's not just Los Alamos and that drainage that it affects. affects us all. And here's a great map that the pioneers put together, just what kind of contamination is across the board. And the big orange blob in the middle is the result of the first atomic bomb that was tested in Chilorosa, and how that has continued to plague with the spread of uranium. And then we've got the oil and gas industry in the Four Corners and also in the Northeast. And you can see the patches in between of various things. So just when we say who it does it affect, I just want to show you who and where and how.
Thank you for that, Valerie. I mean, it's very sobering to see, like, at on a smaller scale and then on a bigger scale, right? Because it is all connected. And, you know, here in New Mexico, and I think throughout the Southwest, it's connected in a way that's like not necessarily perceptible every day. Will, I wanted to see if you wanted to take on this question too about, you know, this aspect of the visible and the invisible when it comes to environmental racism, in terms of what you've observed in your community and even elsewhere.
Sure, yeah, and maybe I'll do that through sharing some images as well. I mean, I've been doing a project lately that's kind of focused on the legacy of uranium extraction on the Navajo Nation, and you know, I'm tentatively calling it Connecting the Dots. And I did run across this map, and I think it speaks to kind of the power of cartography and map making, and you know, these different overlays that we can put on the land just to kind of inform ourselves about what's out there, and maybe like the issues that are kind of interrelated. But the map that I ran across was a collaboration between the Navajo Nation EPA and the United States EPA, and it's of 521 abandoned uranium mines on the nation. And you know, so I thought about that a little bit, and you know, in my own family history, relatives worked at those sites. I played at this uranium processing mill that's just outside of Tuba City when I was a kid, called Rare Metals, kind of euphemistically named Rare Metals. And maybe I'll share some images. Let's see, swap screens. So this isn't actually my photograph, but this is the Rare Metals site. You know, when I was a kid, I remember this very specifically. And you can see the kind of tailings. You know, speaking of environmental racism and racism in general, you know, so much has been, I think, made lately from like this notion has been really charged, or this kind of slogan, "I can't breathe." You know, obviously in response to George Floyd's murder. But it makes me think about, you know, environmental toxins and kind of the effects of this radiation contamination that is present on the Navajo Nation.
Hey, Will,
Yeah.
can I pause you? For some reason, we can't see your screen.
Oh, you know what? I think I forgot to share it. Let me see.
Yay, there it
All
is.
right. Cool. Yeah, so this is the rare metal site that I was just talking about, and this is a map showing where it is in relation to Tuba City, the community I grew up in the Western Navajo Agency. Now it's a Superfund site, right? And there's some remediation that's taken place in relation to this. But in relation to the idea of environmental racism and this notion of "I can't breathe," you know, it makes me think of the people who worked in those mines, and and the families that kind of welcomed these people home and were exposed to the contamination, the houses that were built with this, tailings debris from the mines. And the fact that the Atomic Energy Commission was fully aware that this stuff was toxic and poisonous. We hear a lot about the Navajo Code Talkers and how, the war was won through the use of Navajo language. But I think that a lot of folks don't realize is, like, some of the fissile material was sourced from the Navajo Nation to create the first nuclear weapons, and then later during the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, a lot of it was sourced from these sites as well. I think up until the 70s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was the sole kind of purchaser of this material. They were doing it through different front corporations, but so there has been some kind of recourse for people who are exposed. There's the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, but again, a lot of people who are working in those mines spoke very little English. They were paid with cash. There's no real paper trails in relation to that, so it's hard to prove a direct connection to that history and to get some form of compensation in relation to that. This is the Church Rock United Nuclear Corporation uranium mill spill site that Valerie was talking about. And these are some of my images, and this is part of this Connecting the Dots project where I'm starting to kind of do an aerial survey in some ways of these different sites. This is on the Babbitt Ranch, just kind of south of the Navajo Nation, but it's right next to the Little Colorado River. And you can also see the depressions in the landscape. This is actually an upgrading facility. But those depressions in the landscape, they fill with water. They're contaminated. Livestock drink from that water. People eat the livestock. These are the evaporation ponds that are part of the remediation project at the Church Rock spill site. This is an amazing kind of monument to the legacy of this history at Mexican Hat, Utah. There's 4,400,000 tons of radioactive mine tailings and kind of the legacy of that site. And when I was photographing this with my drone, I kind of zoomed in on it, and I noticed this thing out in the middle of the kind of sea of river rocks, and there's this really bizarre plaque out there memorializing this site in the center. And I also think about how these technologies are also kind of empowering in some ways. This is the White Mesa Uranium Processing Mill. And this is only 2 or 3 miles upgrade from the Ute Mountain reservation. And it's clearly a kind of present source of contamination, and it's only a couple miles away from an indigenous community today. So maybe I'll stop my share if I can find it. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. When I look at these images, I'm reminded of, yes, there is a visible aspect to environmental racism. And I think about, in the media, how the apocalypse is depicted, in movies, and it's complete destruction. And then, then there's an aftermath. and in some and Will, of course, I'm thinking of your work, but in some ways, like we've gone through the apocalypse, or
Yeah.
you know, like it's incrementally happening or has happened in massive waves, and I think that's like something to wrap our heads around as well, because you know, if the apocalypse is like this life-changing, earth-changing event, that's already happened. You know, colonization happened. Like all of these things have happened and are continuing to happen. And so like the apocalypse is like ongoing in this kind of uncanny way. Um, and so, you know, I wanted to ask this question about aesthetics. And put that forth to both of you, because you know, we have these kind of documents of what's happening. um, we have cartography, we have, you know, these kinds of archives that we can draw from, and then we have aesthetics, which does something a little bit different than, you know, this other set of visual culture that we can draw from. And I wonder, you know, about what aesthetics can do that shifts the dialogue enough to make us reconsider or even consider for the first time the aspects of environmental racism and these kinds of cultural shifts, ecological shifts, all of these shifts that are happening in tandem together. And so what is the role of aesthetics and art in this process of coming to consciousness?
I mean, I think for me anyway, it's very personal, and then hopefully it can be a vehicle to kind of share, kind of bring forth some of these ideas, and then, you know, just I think on some level, I'm a pretty introverted person, but I really want to be like part of a community that's working towards a solution. So, I think, you know, like right now I'm really investigating a kind of potential collaboration with Dene College, and thinking about like how we can take that project of surveying all of these things and, you know, a critical indigenous cartography, and kind of extending it to, you know, maybe a center for like the reformation of the notion of remediation, you know, so that it becomes like an indigenous remediation. And what does that mean? You know, do we invite, you know, customary like Hatafis, the singers, to like help us kind of reintegrate ourselves with the land through like, you know, kind of customary spiritual practice? Or are there specific kind of protocols necessary for engaging like frontline communities in order to kind of get those stories? I mean, the drone imagery and the work is, you know, for me anyway, it's been very solitary and kind of, you know, it's just me out on the landscape with my camera and my drone. But I also really want to start talking to people who live next to these sites, whose families worked in them. I mean, I think Valerie's book, I just started reading it, really kind of brought up an issue for me, talking about like, you know, Navajo veterans who are coming back from the war, like working in those mines. I'm like, oh my God, you know, these people who we honor as heroes are also at the afterwards being exposed to these incredibly dangerous kind of places, without any regard for their, you know, their well-being. And those stories are out there. And, you know there's incredible people working on all of these issues. And I think using kind of, you know, this form of art to extend to community and to just like re-engage a dialogue around stuff, at least for me, is it's really exciting, and opens up a lot of possibilities for kind of rethinking what remediation could be, for example.
I have some more slides to share. I was pretty deliberate about using art in my book, and I did so because, as you can see from my background, I am an artist, and thankfully the publishers were able to put some of my own art in the book. But just the front cover is very, I should say, the picture that's up at the left, it's an artist friend of mine, Craig George from Blue Gap, Arizona, who did this oil painting. And I thought it was really profound because, to me, his work talks about the Relocation Act and how his own story is how we both grew up in Los Angeles for a period of time and then wound our way back to New Mexico into this area, him in Blue Gap, which is just on the border, about 30 minutes from New Mexico. And just, what we're dealing with now in the uranium contamination. Blue Gap has 21 abandoned uranium mines, and the family doesn't have running water. They have an outhouse. It's very much a very different story, but I wanted that to be the cover of my book, and instead I got a collage, which is even more powerful because it really speaks to the other things in my book. So here's Craig George's beautiful oil painting, and I have this quote down here that's from my book, and each of the chapters I make a note of a quote at the beginning, sort of prompt the thought process of what's going on. And here it talks about the cruel irony of Native people being forced to the edge of extinction, forced to the edge, the cliff of environmental issues because of industrialism, for example, but they're also pushed back into the reservation because of poverty. That's lack of opportunities elsewhere. And I think there's another notion of how we can use art to bring about action and bring about education of issues. And Mount Taylor is one of them. In November of 2019, the Mount Taylor mine decided to close and has reapplied for a permit to allow groundwater contamination, essentially a permit to facilitate discharge from what's going to happen during the closure of the mine. But yet it brings about another issue of what's going to happen to uranium mines and production, and what's going to happen to our waste. That's still an issue that we're grappling with. And how is it that we honor the people when Mount Taylor is a sacred site to all the tribes, and even ones that are not in New Mexico? It's a huge pilgrimage site where people still come and they gather resources and minerals and plants that are sacred to their ceremonies. And down below is another form of art, which is through the expression of cartoonism, but it also brings about the notion of blood quantum and the issues of what's going to happen to us as a Native people. And that, if you're interested, ties into the critical race theory of sort of what the nation's grappling with right now, with why do Native people have to have a blood quantum? The notions of what Black is and what white is are something that's in the news today. We're sort of grappling with those questions, and it all ties back to white supremacy. And I think just bringing back the photograph that's at the top, historical photos that we don't see every day, but remind folks, here is the atomic bomb. We have it captured. Here's what the human population is capable of. And then folks who are on the ground, this is another form of art, right? Protest. And I got cancer, I'm a downwinder, I'm a survivor, I'm fighting for my rights still. That's part of human art and how we voice our concerns. The two photos at the bottom are on the cover of my book, and that is from a very famous photographer, Dan Budnick, who passed away during the COVID times last year. And he went back to the Church Rock area for 35 years to document what happened after the spill. And the photograph at the top was taken on the Perkle River close by the Church Rock just 6 months after the spill. So folks were grazing their sheep up there and not clearly understanding the dangers, because you can't see radiation, you can't see the harm that uranium causes, or the fact that it's going to be here with us for a long, long time. And Navajo people saw the barrels at the bottom of the yellow cake that was scraped off and put into these containers and then hauled off, but they never knew where that contamination went. And now we're starting to understand that with the nuclear chain, we may be taking contaminations from our backyard, but it's probably going to be put in another community of color elsewhere, whether it's China or India or a poor country or another disenfranchised Native community. So yes, it does affect us all, and we can't brush our environmental racism from one place to another without recognizing that. And this is Fred Cabote's painting, which I think it's interesting, right? With art, the memory of what's happened, and we forget that the policies and the practices that have gone on are part of where colonialism began. And the 1680 Pueblo Revolt is a huge part of the cultural memory and distrust of what's happened, an acknowledgement that at that particular time, it was a shift from forced slavery and dealing with invasive species, dealing with animals and people that came to the land who were forcibly very harsh upon the people and upon the land. So that's just one. And I mentioned the petroglyphs as being something that it speaks to us and still has a message. And if you're interested in deciphering what the petroglyphs are, Greg Cajete's book on Native Science talks a lot about the correlation of them and their significance. And at the corner of 12th and Mountain in Albuquerque is Nora's Numbawagi, which is the photograph at the top. It's actually an earth sculpture that talks about how Pueblo people were here for a long, long time. This is a centering sort of place. Numbawagi means like the core, the centering of oneself. So that's a reminder of our history and our connections to the land and how we view this place-based knowledge. In Albuquerque, I got this from the UNM Photo Archives. This is the South Valley of Albuquerque, which, if you don't know and haven't read my book yet, has the shortest human lifespan of all of New Mexico, and is in a really toxic soup due to industrialization, but it wasn't like that. This is just 1930s. And for everybody who goes down to Albuquerque to the south side, you know it's a whole different story. And there's tons of hazardous waste, deliberate placement of industry, salvage yards, industrial plants. And that's a form of discrimination, environmental racism. And the power of Nora Naranjo Morse, she's now gone into trying to get billboards and plaster messages on the sides of buses, because this is a form of art and we can speak and say something. And she says that here, this concept of protecting the sacredness, it's going to continue because people have sort of placed their mark and continue to do so. Billboards are the next phase, she said, with this environmental message. And I think street art as well, right, can speak volumes. And while maybe 50 people can go into a gallery and view the art there, street art speaks to everyone. And this is some of my art that I do the craft of paper cutting and sort of have paid my ode to what's going on. The woman who's holding up "Only Creator Can Relocate Me" is Roberta Blackgoat, who's Dene coal protester, the Desert Rock, and the fight for coal not to be mined on the Black Mesa. Actually, that was her stand. So it's homage to her. And I think we forget also that our youth and how we learn and how we relay things, there's a huge potential in incorporating art and understanding. So this is something that we found in school, poster board from the child who was trying to relay what's going on with fracking in the Chaco area. And I think people, the actual people power, this is 350.org, who did this flash mob type of thing, and it worked. It got the city of Santa Fe to put more water into the river because a lot of people showed what it would be like if we had that. Of course, it's not perfect, but that's how we change things. It's the people power.
Thank you. So this will be my last question, and then we can look through some of the questions in Q&A and chat. But this is just about the future and what justice looks like in the future as we move forward, and what ethics looks like, or even reparations look like as we move forward.
I think it depends on each place and each people. And reparation isn't always environmental restoration. I don't think we can ever restore the environment to what it was pre-contamination or pre-destruction. But what and how people define justice, what they want to see, I think is the most important thing as we move forward. Well,
yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I think about the moratorium that the Navajo Nation and the council passed back in 2005, where they were like, no more of this, you know, it's caused enough trauma. And I'm interested to do a little more research into the history of that, and like, you know, the activists, and I'm sure there were frontline community people who actually brought that to the council and said, you know, let's end this practice, you know, and recognize that it's been wrong. I mean, there's a lot of money available in the Navajo Nation for remediation. And I'm just wondering about what that means, and where those resources are going to be going. I mean, part of this kind of dream of the Connecting the Dots project, and kind of bringing together, I think, interdisciplinary expertise around this issue is, you know, about inspiring like Navajo young people to become like hydrologists and specialists in earth sciences and remediation, and, you know, use those resources to channel that back into like indigenous communities, rather than giving it to, you know, firms that come from outside that specialize in, you know, nuclear disaster remediation, you know, and I can only imagine that the specialists of those firms probably know the work because they've been from the corporate, like, people who caused the problems in the first place, you know, and I think if that happens, that would be very unjust. And if there's a way to, you know, raise like attention about this, and then also bring together, I think, you know, the right community of indigenous folks and allies, accomplices, to kind of reframe what remediation might be, that that could be moving towards something on an idea of justice, you know.
Yeah, I plopped a couple of things in the chat. It was on the New York Times just a couple of days ago. President Inez on the news talking about the uranium mines and how there's a push now to address some of these concerns. And we know that there's been activism to protect Chaco Canyon, but there's also, I think, a duty for all of us to address the structural inequity that we're seeing in our backyard, which is that there are folks who don't have running water, and water is essential, especially during the COVID times when folks are asked to wash their hands for 20 seconds, to be extra clean and extra diligent, and they can't. I mean, what would you choose? Would you choose to have a glass of water to drink to satisfy your thirst, or wash your hand 20 times a day? And those are hard choices for people, and they can't always get out. And then they always have to think about the livestock and the animals that are also, their responsibility that we forget about. So there's something that we can do. We can donate to projects like Dig Deep, but we can also, I think, demand that there be some sort of action taken as a human rights type of issue for our state, for the nation. The Navajos are the second who have a lack of infrastructure. It's actually Alaska Natives who have the highest lack of infrastructure. And there's a great report that was put out by the U.S. Water Alliance, which I'll put in the chat, that talks about that, the water access gap. And what communities are still lacking water is startling, but we're the second with the largest population.
So I know we've been getting questions and comments in chat and in Q&A, but I wanted to just go through those and see if we do have answers. So I'm going to go through Q&A first. So from Shane Flores, we have, how can our communities prepare for an uptick in water extraction as water wars increase due to climate change? Can a cultural memory of communal land use point the way towards resistance to water extraction? Do we want to take that on?
Well, what are your thoughts?
Boy, can a communal memory of, or can a cultural memory of community land use point the way to resistance? Yeah, I mean, I think there is knowledge like encoded in people, and I don't know, maybe the acequia system in New Mexico is a good model for that, and understanding about how, community comes together and understands and like regulates and moderates a vital resource. I'm trying to think of specific kind of ideas on Navajo, and I can't think of anything in particular, except that I know the Navajo Nation has a huge claim to the Colorado River, and that there have been attempts. There's great YouTube footage of former Senator John McCain and Flake getting run out of Tuba City after their proposal to potentially propose water systems coming into the res in exchange for the rights to all of this water, and they got run out of town. I hope that I know that people understand that water is such a vital resource on the nation, and that that we have a claim to it, like an important kind of sovereign claim to it, and that's well kind of stewarded, but that's all I have right now.
I could think of an example. In my book, there's a chapter on this Letta Pueblo and their battle over water. And this is a communal rite. They started seeing elders becoming sick from the use of river water for ceremonies and for agricultural purposes. The river that flows downstream from the city of Albuquerque goes right through their pueblo to the heart of the plaza, which has traditional agriculture, but this was all connected really, I think, to ceremony. So the governor at the time had to, Verna Olgenteller had to stop all ceremonies and tell people not to have any connection with the water. And they went into a legal battle to obtain stricter water quality standards than the city of Albuquerque, than the state, than the EPA. And they won. And it went all the way to the New Mexico Supreme Court and was upheld that that particular tribal entity had sovereign rights to dictate that they could have cleaner water. And as a result, Albuquerque has had to build a multi-million-dollar wastewater treatment plant to deal with the arsenic levels and to clean their water to a higher standards, which is actually a good thing. So I have faith that they inspired a lot of folks to do the same. More questions?
We do. We have 2 questions from Anna MacArthur. So the first one is for Will, and it's about whether you've shared the collection of this work, where the uranium mines are, and what has the changes for the communities there when they see these images.
Well, I haven't shown them on the nation yet. I mean, I kicked off this project right before the pandemic kind of set in, and all of the kind of curfews and the prohibitions about traveling, and to some extent I wanted to respect that. I mean, I'm usually by myself, and the work is relatively new. I do have an exhibition right now at the University of Austin, or University of Texas Austin, their Visual Arts Center. You can check out their website, and I'm exhibiting some of that work there. But I'm really hoping to kind of create a collaboration with the Dene College and expand this. There's 521 of these sites, and I think just that alone as a kind of start to a project is a lot, and will put me kind of in community and kind of sourcing this. I do have a pretty good connection. I have an in-law who's the chapter president of the Cameron chapter, and there's 100 mines along the stretch of Arizona Route 89 between Flag and to the city, and so Milton So is the person who I'm hoping to kind of collaborate around that region, which is kind of my home region. But yeah, I mean, the community interface is something that I'm working towards developing.
And then we have another question from Anna as well, about whether or not there's a resource center set up for various Native communities so that they can gather as much information on their own and have access to remediations, such as bioremediations, and maybe gather funding resources to help those communities in their needs to heal, get justice for the problems.
There's a number of organizations that are working on some really interesting projects. The ideas that are out there are bioremediation with the uptake of plants like hemp, for example, to absorb the chemicals from uranium. The issue, I think, is what do you do with the crop that's contaminated? Where does that thing go? So they're grappling with that. It's not that bioremediation isn't out there. There are folks like Dene Introspective, Dene Care, Indigenous Lifeways, Navajo or Dene Indigenous Lifeways. There's a group of Shiprock farmers that are concerned about the Gold King mine spill and trying to figure out bioremediation and how to clean the water up there. So a lot of good thoughts, and I think it just is a matter of funding. And hopefully with the legislation this session, there's some emphasis on farms, and if we make a case that we really need to take care and clean up the land in order to feed us, that may be the little fire that gets it started with funding. And of course there's Deb Holland, right? who's gonna work on the federal lands aspect, so fingers crossed.
Protect the bears, Deb.
The bears, come on.
Shashja.
There's that great hashtag. So before I continue with the questions, we have a survey in the chat. If anybody wants to, this is a question, but I would urge people who are listening and watching in to take this survey. It will be really helpful for us as we move forward in our programming. And so Amy put it in the chat, but there is another question, and it's from Amy. And she says, Will, I'm curious about land ownership or leasing issues of the land the uranium sites are located on. Who controls the land, and for how long have they been there?
Well, in 2005, the Navajo Nation, the Tribal Council passed a moratorium, so there's no more active mining on the Navajo Nation. I know that in the checkerboard area towards like Mount Taylor, there's some issue with leasing because some of that land is, kind of private, and there's potentially a kind of, entry point for, I guess there's a new form of uranium extraction that's similar to hydraulic fracturing, where they don't have to do the same kind of surface excavation or extraction. But it's not going on in the Navajo Nation anymore. I think previous, it was, I think it was small LLCs on one level, and then like major corporations like Kerr-McGee and, that were entering leases with the nation, or on a smaller level with grazing permit and home site lease owners. Like a lot of the mines are named like the specific, Arthur Yazzie Mine 2, and it's a reference to the fact that, it was a kind of individual collaboration with that land, the home site lease owner. You can apply to the nation for a home site lease and get like a 75-year lease, and you have some jurisdiction over that land. And I know that that's how it happened in the past. It's not happening now, fortunately.
So speaking of fracking, we have another question about talking about fracking on federal lands in New Mexico and the physical and permanent marks that are left by the infrastructure.
I think one of the greatest dangers with fracking is that it breaks up rock. We have a fluid that is considered hazardous toxic waste, and it's meant to be destructive to the land in order to break up the rocks to extract gas. And then once that fluid comes out, it's even more toxic because it's mixed with gas. But a lot of spills occur that aren't cleaned up on the surface, and that infiltrates back into the ground. So we have to think about that aspect, but just the contamination underground is a concern. If those that are interested in the Permian Basin should probably be concerned about Holtec. And if we have just so much fracking going on in that area, but we want to bury the most hazardous uranium waste in our country, in that neck of the woods, it's just not a good idea. So advocate now to stop that. it's something that we can do.
Right, yeah, the Permian Basin is like a whole other situation. And then WIP, this a Mobius strip of extraction and putting it back. So we have a question or kind of a comment from Catherine Shira, who just learned about a federal program, Superfund JTI, which recruits workers from communities near Superfund sites to do cleanup of the sites. Workers seem to get very little safety training and likely have no long-term health monitoring. I know there's at least one Superfund JTI program for AUM in New Mexico. Any thoughts?
I'm with Will. I think that we should have this whole just transition that the state's been talking about is really to train our own people on how to do remediation, how to do long-term cleanup, because once the solar panels are in place, that industry, as far as jobs, is going to dry up. We know that the coal plants are going to close, and hopefully the state won't turn to nuclear energy as a renewable source because it's not clean and it's not renewable. So the next source of jobs would be cleanup. This would be a great way to do that just transition. And I think the Navajo Nation and the workers in the Four Corners area are particularly piqued and want to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, amping up the kind of protection of those people obviously is something that sounds like needs to be, you know, thought out a little better. I haven't heard of this program in relation to Superfund sites, but I mean, there's certainly, you know, there's a community of people who need good paying jobs. That there's no shortage of that, but you know, it needs to be done right. And well, that's an interesting thing. I'd be interested in learning more about that, I guess.
I think that brings the issue back on equity, right? In that whole environmental racism component, it's really important for folks to have an understanding of what they're dealing with and get the information. And that's what we didn't see during the livestock period, where folks purposely had to deal with pesticides and flea dip cattle, the uranium miners that had to deal with contaminated things in their work, and yet they weren't aware because they were misinformed or uninformed. And so that is a level of justice that we have to push forward this day and age.
And it seems like continually push forward, like it's not a given that people are going to be told what the health risks are going to be, especially when they come from communities that are already devalued. And I think that that's, I think maybe what this comment is getting to about this program. It's like when you're already like taking about a community that's been devalued, and then you're like not protecting them in a way that helps them keep remediate their community. It's like another layer of environmental racism, like, you know, compounding the rest. And so I think that like the deliberateness that you talked about, Valerie, can go both ways, right? Like you can deliberately not tell people what's healthy for them and what's not healthy for them. And then you can deliberately tell people. And like, we should err on the side of like deliberately telling people and making people aware, especially in our most vulnerable communities.
Right. Well, sometimes they don't know to ask, right?
Yeah, that's true too. Exactly. I don't see any more questions, but I'm going to remind everybody that there's a chat again. There's the chat, the survey in the chat. If anybody, I urge everybody who is here tonight to take that survey, to participate. If anybody has any other last minute questions, I think I caught them all. I hope I caught them all. then you know, check out some of these links that that were shared in the chat as well. There's a lot of really good knowledge to be gained and to share within our communities, outside of our communities. And I just want to really thank Will and Valerie. And I think that Amy has some last pieces of information she wants to share. And if Valerie and Will, if you have anything else that you want to share, I invite you to do so now.
I'm grateful to come here and to talk to you both and present on the book. I encourage you to buy local if you can. The book's available at Collected Works in Santa Fe and the Indian Public Cultural Center in Albuquerque. Go there first before Barnes & Noble. It's there too. And really, it's doing what it's meant to be, what it was purposed for, right? So I wanted the book, and it's pretty small. It's not that, you know, cumbersome. I want it to be easily readable. It's for the layman. It's for the UNM Sustainability Studies class. It's using it in their class right now as mandatory reading. It's for the environmental high school classes and New Mexico history classes that don't have this type of supplemental reading. These chapters that I have in my book are all my grad papers, all my personal research interest essays that I created and then compiled for this book, because I couldn't find that information in my New Mexico history class. I couldn't find that information in what's going on with the history of New Mexico, period. And this is about land use, and it's about the history of policies and practices that have an impact on where we're going in our future planning. So I'm happy to have the ability to answer questions and just ask you all to read it and talk about it, continue the discussion and do something. Support the organizations that are listed in the back of the book, as well as make a voice for what you're passionate about.
Thanks, Valerie.
Yeah, I just got the book too. It's wonderful. I've cruised through 3 chapters of it today, and I learned a lot. So yeah, it's a great resource, and I'm excited to share it with my daughter. She's been complaining a lot about like New Mexico history, you know, through the public schools. Yeah, I guess I would just share that I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue and conversation, and you know, check out my work if you get a chance. My website is, you know, if you Google Will Wilson in photography, you'll find me. There's an exhibition, the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum of Contemporary Native Art is going to be doing an exhibition in August. That's going to be focused on a lot of different kind of indigenous, like, artistic responses, creative responses to the notion of kind of exposure. I think it's called Exposure, Native American Art and Political Ecology. So I think that'll be an exciting kind of exhibition to check out, and they're also going to do a publication kind of in relation to that. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Will. Amy, do you have anything that you want to share or take the survey?
Yes, please take that survey, and please join us for the upcoming lasers. We have one coming up in June and in August, and they're all slightly different. InPlace, the aesthetics of placemaking through land-based practices, is June 24th, and InPlace, ecologies of sound in the Southwest, is on August 19th. So thank you for joining us, and please fill out the survey. Thank you so much.